in addition to the backward movement of the working class, wages in this country peaked in the 1970s. They stagnated through the 80s and 90s, just about, with some variation. And in the 21st century, we have been moving backwards. It's not just the entry-level wages that have moved backwards or union density. If you look at inequality within the working class, the racial income gap, the gender income gap, those items are growing. That's one of the signs that when we are advancing, we are moving toward equality. When they are advancing on us, we are moving away from equality. Not just within the classes, but among the classes, but within the working class itself. You finally got some pushback from below because the way that they are structured, they're incapable of coming up with the answers of the time. Wisconsin was very important because it broke the air of despair. And if you're talking about Occupy, what Occupy does represent, it represents the potential of a class movement broader than the unions themselves, broader than these service-providing organizations, these dozens of separate businesses that federated together. But the challenges had to do with, one, what happens on the outside, at the grassroots, how we develop from that, and the education that we can provide inside them. Because there is nothing that will tell common people, working people, what is going on, the nature of what is happening. Part of that is so that each round of austerity can be introduced as something new. Okay, we have a new situation, but there's not that much bad accounting in the world. There is intention. There is intention to it, and that is up to us to publicize. It's not just intention. It's a plan that's been in the works for in its fourth decade now. There is the nature of the program and where the resistance comes from. It comes from below, and it comes from the broader movement than the trade unions. I'll leave it there.
Great, so we have plenty of time for discussion. I think what we'll do is we'll take like a few questions or comments at a time, and then if the speakers want to come back later, but rather than having just a pure kind of question and answer session. We have plenty of time, and there's not a ton of people here, so we can probably have a good full discussion, but I'm still going to try to keep people to 3 minutes just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak if they want to, and then if there's time for them to come on a second time, we can always do that. And so that's what we're going to do. Go ahead.
What are the prospects for pressure from below and outside the labor movement that you were talking about affecting the actual structure of unions themselves? So as you were saying, maybe, is there the possibility, or are there prospects in the future, near future, that we can have genuine unions that are genuinely representing the shop floor, like maybe there was that brief period that the CIO did? Is that possible? Can the Occupy movement report that? Is anything like that starting to happen amongst the labor outreach committees within Occupy?
There's a few more questions, comments. Feel free to raise your hand when somebody else is speaking. I'll just kind of keep stats. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, my name is Eric Josephson. I am a transit worker, a track walker, or track inspector, and an open communist, a supporter of the League for the Revolutionary Party, and the distributed revolutionary transit worker. To my co-workers, and I'd like to address what you said. Transport Workers Union, many other unions, are plenty undemocratic. I think if those unions overnight got a much more democratic structure, very little would change. I'm for vastly more democratic unions, but the unions aren't collaborationist with the bosses because they're undemocratic. They're undemocratic because the leadership collaborates with the bosses. I think that, and I think that New Directions, the former caucus, been defunct now for quite a while, in Transport Workers Union Local 100, emphasized the democratic struggle over the class struggle with a never well-explained point of view, which I got out of everything they said and did, that first you get democracy, then you can have more militants and more class struggle. I think that for most workers, it goes the other way. Every so often, some outrage happens, or there's a building sense of struggle, and workers go into motion, and before they can come up against the bosses, they come up against the union bureaucracy. Oh, you can't even bring that up at this meeting, at this union meeting. A whole lot of people show up at a union. That's out of order. Let's move on to to some other topic. So workers fight for democracy because they want to fight the bosses. Democracy is a tool. So, and I'm for it, obviously. It makes it much easier for revolutionaries and other fighters to try to organize. I think that the various attacks on workers and other oppressed all over the world under the guise of neoliberalism, which will soon turn to statism. It will soon turn to capitalist statism. Neoliberalism will not work much longer. But it happens because the capitalists really are in crisis.
30 seconds.
Their system really is bankrupt. I would like to hear from the panelists some of the ideas being put forward, for example, by Occupy Wall Street, even though it is not a workers' movement. Many people in Occupy Wall Street have helped to popularize the idea of the general strike. Some of them tried to call a general strike. They couldn't. It wasn't a general strike. But I think that the job of revolutionaries and other militants is to explain what the general strike can do for us. Of course, we can't call it tomorrow, the day after, the week after.
I forgot to say, I'll just try to tap my pencil. You've got 30 seconds left approximately, just so that you know. Please.
You know what, I'm gonna pass and let them answer unless somebody else has another question. And then
You can
ask
feel free
later.
to throw something out, and then they can come back and answer a bunch of questions.
All right, well, I guess it's actually related to your comments. You know, with Occupy, I hear a lot about sort of, you know, financial mechanisms, like the 325-page comment letter on the Volcker Rule, et cetera, and you know, and issues of taxation, et cetera. And I wonder, and I'm not quite sure how to formulate this. Yes, it's all related, finance is all related to what's going on with the labor movement, but I don't see a lot of fight back from labor about the fact that, you know, in a lot of ways, finance is is on the ropes. They're, you know, they need the pension money to be able to keep generating the kind of revenues that they generate. If there was a capital strike tomorrow, what happened in 2007, 2008 would happen all over the The answer I get from people in labor, well, sort of more higher up people is that the rules make it impossible for them to control those pools of capital. That there's no, you know, the money sort of is the workers, but it's been taken away, and that there's nothing they can do about it. Do you really think that's true? Is that something to organize around, having greater control over that money? Or is that sort of a side issue and it isn't really an issue in terms of rebuilding the loop? All right, Peter in the back.
So, my name's Peter, I'm a teacher here in New York, active in the UFT. I wanted to thank Tim for highlighting the role of the unions in 1975, because I think that's crucial in terms of understanding why the union bureaucracy in New York has been unable to actually build the kind of movement that we need in order to challenge the austerity threats that we're under. In particular, I think the role that the UFT played, going back to 1968, in terms of dividing itself from the community that we as teachers serve, and the real place where we can, you know, draw any social power is with alliance with parents and students, and that's why the union bureaucracy made that deal in '75 to support the city with our pension money, because they didn't have any strategic way of aligning themselves with those community movements that Tim was talking about. And I think one of the exciting things about Occupy is that it offers the potential of recreating those kind of alliances, and I think there's movement within the UFT to do that. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what your perspective is in terms of on the ground inside TWU, given that you've got a leadership at this point that has ruled out a strike around the current contract, and did so before the contract expiration deadline, which was, in my understanding, pretty unprecedented in terms of previous bargaining periods. But one that is struggling to recover from the Toussaint dictatorship, and I think is in many ways has its heart in the right place in terms of trying to do some mobilization, but hasn't been able to do that, and has played a useful role in terms of Occupy Wall Street, trying to highlight those mobilizations and connecting you to them. So I'm just curious to hear more about that. And then I also wanted to point out that I think Occupy has successfully changed, to a small degree, the bargaining climate in the city. If you look at some of the contracts that got settled in the last 3 or 4 months with the nurses at private hospitals and with 32BJ, where there were serious strike threats on the table, and they got relatively good deals because they were willing to. And I think part of that is because there is some fear of what a real strike could look like in the current political climate in New York, and I think there's some fear on the other side about that. So I'm just curious what you guys think.
Great. Since there's not, I'm going to throw it back to you guys if you want to respond to any of the questions, and then but I'll keep taking stabs if anyone wants to get on.
The first thing with genuine labor organizations, I mean, they break out all the time. I mean, in the early 20th century, while the AFL was the Workers' Movement for White Supremacy, there was an organization called the IWW that represented what people in this room would consider the labor movement of the time. In the latter part of the 19th century, that organization was the Knights of Labor. It just passed the midpoint for those excluded from the National Labor Union. There was the Colored National Labor Union. At all points in between, there were literally dozens of independent unions that no longer exist, suffered at the hands. One of the things is that there are one industry where African Americans started that we're almost entirely purged from now is not urban mass transit, but the railroads. That the entire period, they were purging black organizations and black workers from railroad jobs through the entire history, in the 19th century, it was John Bracey did some research that he presented in the 1970s talking about, he actually researched police records about black workers on the railroads that were murdered. And the culprits were always testifying, well, the white union is paying us to do this. So it's not that there won't be alternative organizations. Is there the potential for that to happen within the structures of current unions? There is some potential, but it also depends a lot on what happens from below, inside those unions. In terms of a thing about New Directions, I just got to respond to this briefly. New Directions was a coalition. And there were folks whose main emphasis was on democracy and winning union office, but there were others. And perhaps that was, this is why I wasn't the ideal presidential candidate when I was running for president, whose entire activity was underground. I picked vacation relief and I went from job action to job action. Some of them I organized, some of them are job actions I organized with, I joined that others had started in RTO. One of the things, besides privatization, that we have to look at in public unions is the dynamic of centralization. By concentrating things toward a center, toward labor relations, toward a lawyer who's not responsible for any transportation, he doesn't suffer the way that your boss does when you stage a job action. So, you know, those are all factors. Finally, there are a lot of deficiencies. While the leadership of Local 100 is open to some good ideas, they are also open to a lot of bad ideas. And they are in a terrible situation. There's a lot of focus on Toussaint as a dictator, and some of that had to do with what I frankly think is mental illness, but the biggest part of it is that Roger Toussaint was an ultimate service unionist. The worst things that happened in Local 100 was the active killing of any shop floor life that we had in the union, and the structuring of the union toward more and more service unionism, more and more staff. The ultimate goal, I mean, Toussaint told us in staff meeting, the ultimate goal is to get as many people on staff as possible. You know, 1199 has 1,500 people on staff. That's our goal. That's our model.
What's that going to do?
Because then you don't have to rely on the membership for any particular mobilization. The problem with membership mobilization is that the members are not a faucet. The rank and file can't be turned on and off, okay? Whereas if you have enough staff to look like you mobilize somebody when you're paying them, of course they're going to be. That's all your fake mobilizations right there.
Just real quickly, I think Tim's right about new organizations. I mean, it's hard to predict. I mean, when they were at the height of the immigrant rights movement, there were all kinds of kind of incipient independent workers organizations around the country that helped organize May Day. And workers went and sat with the bosses. We're not coming in on May Day. And sometimes the bosses would negotiate, okay, can you come in on Saturday? Or people just said, we're not coming in, period. Because in those days, it was relatively easy for people to get another job if they got fired at the same amount of pay. And there's all kinds of things like that, different worker centers organizations, which are kind of semi-unions or incipient unions, and as well as, you know, there's always a rebellion brewing someplace, you know, in existing unions. And Occupy Wall Street, in a way, provided a lightning rod that attracted all these different elements. We're now kind of, switch metaphors, they're cross-pollinating with each other a little bit and trying to figure out a strategy. I think that's a key thing, because I really took to heart something Tim said a while ago in his introduction, that we fought one hospital at a time or one school at a time, and I think we're still, unfortunately, we're compelled to do that because we don't yet have an organization to stop that. But I think what the advantage that we have is they actually do have this bigger vision, right? With Occupy, the system is the problem. Why doesn't Occupy Wall Street have a demand? Because it's the system, stupid. We're against everything. Now within that, there's a whole range of politics, populist to class struggle-oriented people to everything in between, people who want to kind of create a camp to prefigure a different kind of society. But the sense of class grievance, if not yet full class consciousness, is really manifest. And so if you can, I think the task right now is to try to find the school or the library that you can make to be a model of the struggle. You model that, and then I think in this atmosphere the rebellion can spread. Certainly the other side thinks so. That's why they're being so aggressive to try and kill it. So, we have to have this sober discussion, but I think it's a very forward-looking, optimistic one. Greg Shotwell, who just wrote this book, it's Live Bait and Ammo, a collection of his shop floor writings for the last 10 years at the GM, has a concluding chapter where he talks about how the bad news is that nobody's barrel is strong enough to get over Niagara Falls alone. The good news is that we're all in it together. We have no choice but to fight back. And I think that's what OWS represents to me in the way in which it was taken to heart by certain millions of working people.
Hi, my name is Pauli. So I have two questions, I think. One is, from the outside, as someone who's not in any union, who's not a labor organizer, but has worked with OWS and has gone to, for example, the labor outreach meetings in which we're talking about why labor is not actually endorsing a general strike. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think it's not organized enough, for one, but then also, for me, I want to know a little bit more about the divide between, because from the outside it seems as if the unions are very, very corrupt and don't have a lot of power. And then when you say that, then it's okay, the union bureaucracy is very corrupt, not necessarily those among the unions. So for me, I want to know, for anyone who is in a union, whether it's transit or electricians or construction, I mean, every single union I've been hearing is totally different in its makeup. Some are extremely conservative and are not interested in certain issues. Others have more radical memberships. But what is the feeling among unions themselves in the city towards the idea of a general strike? And then two, what is the divide between, or is there a massive gap between the union bosses and the worker, the rank and file, and what is the rank and, is there increasing consciousness among the rank and file right now to really change the structure of unions themselves? And then my second question was related to that. In India, we just had a general strike on the 28th, and a lot of people say, okay, in a general strike, you have to have demands. And I personally agree with that, because you're stopping the flow of capital and you're creating an extreme amount of pressure to get something you want done immediately or as immediately as possible. But among concrete demands that the Indian workers had, and there were tens of millions of them in the streets, not only was there increase in pay, pensions, etc., but also there was one major demand, which was the end to neoliberalization in India, the end to privatization and neoliberalization in India. And that is a very broad demand that I think resonates with something like Occupy, which there are many, many, many demands. It's not that it has no demands, but it's that the demand is so broad, which is an end to capitalism as we know it, that, that's really the case. And so you had the example of a general strike in which that kind of a broad demand was on the table. So, so my question there is, what does the organized labor movement, not that it can think one thing, but what are the feelings among organized labor in that regard?
Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Alvin. I'm also a supporter for the Revolutionary Party. And not being in any particular union at the time, but looking at the history of, in particular, the UFT and the TWU, it's good to look at what has been the overwhelming mistake of sort of looking at the unions as one big bureaucracy with not many differences within them, in a sense that, you know, the whole union is just corrupt. It's set up just the top layers that act as brokers between bosses and workers. In particular, if you look at the UFT, which a lot of the gains that they won through the massive struggles in the 60s and 80s are now in the chopping block, like particular tenure. They're not going in for it right away, but they're chopping away at it, you know, little clauses here and there. And I think it's always been the same response from the union bureaucracy to say, no, we can't fight now. We should vote. My question is how, in particular in the UFT, and I don't know with the TWU, a lot of the dues and funds are used for campaigns, right? To funnel money into the Democratic Party or buses for lobbying day or something like that. If they really did show support and send out the troops for Occupy Wall Street, then they wouldn't have to use it as to justify that they were fully for Occupy Wall Street. Look, we let you use our union hall to store food, or we gave you a small check or something like that, instead of with the potential to call out so many workers. I'm posing it as a sort of question: what would be the sort of winning strategy?
I have Cindy in the back, and then I have an open list. So we do still have time, so people should feel free to raise any questions, comments. No question is too small.
I'm Cindy. I'm in Local 153 OPEI, in New York City. I'm also a member of the Socialist Organization and Labor Outreach Committee of Occupy Wall Street. The problem is that everybody's lumping the unions together as one cohesive, or even each union as one cohesive body, and it's not. It's made up of this bureaucracy that's under another umbrella bureaucracy, and we all know all the things wrong with the bureaucracy, but everybody keeps saying labor as if it's one thing, and really the truth is it's our rank and file. A union is only as strong as its rank and file, for one thing. And if your rank and file's consciousness is not at the level to have a strike, keep asking why can't we have a general strike in New York. Believe me, I would love to see a general strike in New York. But if your rank and file's consciousness, if your rank and file doesn't see a benefit for going on strike, and they're not going to go on strike, you don't call a strike. Because if you can't deliver, you're in a much worse position than if you don't even try. And like, I have organized strike votes at my workplace. I'm on the negotiating committee, and we never take strike off the table because we know we can deliver. But if we didn't think we could deliver, we wouldn't be doing that. And that's the first thing. And that's been why labor within the Labor Outreach Committee is mostly been arguing against the general strike. Because we know we have not done the work, the hard work, no shortcuts, the stuff you have to do to be able to bring a massive amount of workers out that day, enough to shut the city down. If we thought we could, we'd be on board to do it. And I just want to make that clear. This has nothing to do with union bureaucracy. This has everything to do with we know our members are not there yet because we have not done that hard work within the unions. We're starting to do it. Occupy's giving us the space to do it. That people are becoming class conscious now, but we still have a few years of work to do. I mean, I don't think it's impossible, especially in a city like New York where we have so many people that are still in unions, but not this way day. So that's the main thing that I want to say about that. And again, the whole idea that every union is different. Like, my union's pretty progressive. My union's pro-legalization. You know, when Sensenbrenner was passed, they signed a pledge saying our workers will go to jail, but they'll continue to provide services. I mean, my union's pretty good on some things. Not everything, but some things. Different unions are different, and so we can't treat them all like one animal and treat them all the same way. We really all have a lot of work to do. Not the workers that are in unions, because it is a small number of workers that are in unions now, but even